If I had to pick favorites, I would say that reptiles and small rodents hold a special place in my heart. And while I don't own any reptiles, I do own guinea pigs, which isn't really the point, I just wanted to mention them because they're cute. That being said though, I'm going to live vicariously through this game and make a zoo with nothing but reptiles. Starting with making the starting path and setting up staff buildings before choosing what reptile I should add to the zoo first. By the way, I used the Planet Zoo wiki reptile list, so if any of this is wrong or I missed some animals, I will not be taking accountability. That being said, the first reptile is actually an animal that I've never really thought of as a reptile, the Aldabra giant tortoise. Nevertheless, I set up this barrier using thick glass. Tortoises don't really need reinforced thick glass to keep them contained, I just thought it looked decorative. I switched the side barriers to wood and left them tall for whatever reason, before adding the staff door and having the tortoises brought to the habitat. And then I realized that the tall sides looked dumb, so I lowered them. I added a watering area before setting up this short purple shelter, which I added bedding inside of. And to be honest, it really doesn't look all that great. Definitely not one of my best shelters. But I was hoping it would look better after I added all the plants. Before I pulled out the plants, though, I went through and gave them all their enrichment items. After which I added some mangrove trees around the water and a few of whatever this tree is around the shelter. I added a ton of these flat bushes around before pulling out these purple flower things, which I placed around the bushes. I also placed some of these blue lotus plants in the water, after which I found my favorite giant rhubarb plant.
Oh, I love this plant. We gotta use some of this.
And after adding clusters of smaller plants around, the greenery was finished, which means it's rock time. I made this mossy rock cluster, which I added throughout the habitat, before making this tropical rock cluster, which I also added throughout the habitat, after which I fixed the terrain to their liking. And after adding donation bins and education speakers, this habitat was done. I jumped almost immediately into making the next habitat, which I originally intended to be for the Komodo dragon, but for reasons unknown, I changed my mind and made it for the Asian water monitors instead. And after checking their habitat requirements, I set up this heart-shaped barrier. I hadn't actually intended to make a heart-shaped barrier, I was just trying not to make a square. Either way though, I changed the front section to null barriers before adding a staff door, after which I had the monitors brought to the habitat, and went about lining the null barrier with this cool stone fence. I did change where the fence met in the middle to wood barrier though, because I didn't want to try and curve the fence pieces. I added water to the habitat first, since everything else was going to be focused around that, after which I added the enrichment items. And normally I might add the shelter next, but these guys don't require any hard shelter, and so I'm skipping that step. And instead I jumped straight into adding foliage, starting by adding plants under the water, before moving on to adding common water lilies to the top, along with some blue lotus plants and a few cattail reeds, after which I moved on to adding greenery to the rest of the habitat, starting with one of my favorite trees, the weeping willow. I placed a fair few bushes around before going in with a variety of plants, which added a lot of nice color, and I just personally really like this gross tall one. I pulled out the terrain next, placing soil everywhere because that's what they wanted the most of, after which I went in with a little grass and a hefty serving of rock. I placed down all their enrichment items, and then it was rock time. Only a few clusters though, because I didn't make this habitat all that big and I didn't want to take up all the space with rocks. There was plenty of space in the water for rocks though, so I added them there to my heart's content. And after adding donation bins and education speakers, that was this habitat done. My next step was to set up a shop area with 2 exhibits in the middle. I also opted to start using the prefab structures, because this zoo is completely self-indulgent, and I simply didn't feel like making my own. I added both the eastern blue-tongued, I almost called it a blue-tongued skink, but that's not what it's called in the game. I added the eastern blue-tongued lizard and eastern brown snake to my zoo, after which I was ready to add my next habitat animal, which is going to be a pair of Komodo dragons. I spent some time setting up this wood barrier with null barriers along the front, which I covered with this red fence, before having the Komodo dragons brought to the habitat. I started by making this canopy, which doubled as a shelter for the dragons and a nice shaded spot for the guests. I gave them a water area before adding all their enrichment and pulling out the greenery, starting by placing a few weeping willows around, and lining the back of the water with some bamboo. I placed a variety of other plants around, which included these blue lotus plants in the water. I did have to extend the barrier a little on the side because the plants took up too much of their traversable area, after which I decided that the middle of the habitat was too plain. So I slapped another weeping willow down, and after adding a few more plants around that, I pulled up the terrain tab and added a little bit of everything because that's what they wanted. After that was done, I put up some rocks, which I placed along the edge of the barrier and around the water, along with a few in the water, of course. And after adding donation bins and education speakers, this habitat was done, and it was now time to address a growing issue. That being that I made the first 3 habitats just big enough for the adult animals in them and left no room for babies. I won't go in depth with the whole habitat building process, seeing as you just watched me make habitats for all these animals, but I made the Aldabra giant tortoise overflow area first, which will continue to change and slowly grow as I make this zoo, because these tortoises produce a whole lot of babies, and those babies take forever to mature. I set up the Asian water monitor baby overflow area next, right beside the Komodo dragons. I set up the Komodo dragon overflow area where I should have put the first 2 off the guest path and tucked away over by the staff buildings. I also put this completely self-indulgent rock waterfall. And with all the baby overflow areas done, for now at least, I was ready to jump into adding the next habitat, which is going to be for the American alligator. So I set up a new path and sunk some terrain before going in with the roughen tool to add some texture, which gave me this fun look. I used wooden barriers to get the initial barrier down, after which I had the alligators brought to the habitat and changed the barrier to thick glass. I placed down their enrichment items before pulling up the nature tab to add the greenery, starting with a few willow trees along with a whole lot of plants in the water. I paused adding greenery briefly to add this large rock wall waterfall, and only after that was in place did I pull up the plants again. I placed quite a few water lilies around before adding cattail reeds along the edge of the water. I was also running low on money at this point, so I placed donation bins and let the game run for a second, finishing off the American alligator greenery with a few more willow trees and a plethora of bushes, which I also took the time to sink into quite a few of the rocks. And after adding education speakers, this habitat was done. Jumping straight into the next habitat, which is going to be for what I called a sharp tortoise in my notes, otherwise known as the African spurred tortoise. I placed a new path and built a barrier with thick glass in the front with no barriers along the back, after which I placed a water source, and changed the barrier to wood along the side because I thought all the no barriers looked weird. I then had the tortoises brought to the habitat, and went about lining the back with rocks, pausing briefly to change the terrain to sand before finishing my rock wall. I pulled out these big trees next, which I used to sink into the rock barrier, before going in with a few of these cork oak trees to add around the habitat itself, placing a few dog bushes around while I was at it, after which I decorated the water, and placed a few clusters of flowers around the habitat. I added the feeding troughs and enrichment next, which is when I found this jelly cake that makes one of the best sounds I've ever heard. Tell me that's not brilliant. After finishing the enrichment, which of course included a rubber ducky, I pulled the terrain back up to add grass back into the habitat, along with a touch of soil. I added a shelter next, which for whatever reason gave me so much trouble, but I eventually just settled for this thatch roof connected to a log situation. Elegant? No. Functional? Kind of. I placed quiet signs, donation bins, and education speakers outside the habitat, and that was the African spurred tortoise habitat done. I made a path along the back of the American alligator habitat, so I had a clear path to expanding the zoo. I also added a shop area back there with 4 more exhibits, which has green iguanas, Gila monsters, Hairman's tortoise, and some boa constrictors. And after adding donation bins and a restaurant, it was time for the next addition to the zoo, which is going to be the Cuvier's dwarf caiman. A brilliant specimen. I really like these goobers. I placed the barrier across from the Asian water monitor baby overflow area, which consisted of thick glass and no barriers in the back with a deep water source. And with that set up, I had them brought to the habitat. Look how cute they are.
They're small like puppy dogs.
Cuteness aside, I pulled up the rocks and lined the back of the no barrier so they couldn't escape, trying to put them at varying heights to make it look more interesting, before going in with more rocks, including some of these moss ones to finish it up. I pulled up the greenery tab and placed a few trees around, after which I placed a few bushes and added some greenery to the top of the water, along with adding a few clusters of underwater eelgrass to the bottom of the water. To finish off the greenery, I placed some reeds along the water and some giant root barb along the back, topping it off with a plethora of smaller plants sprinkled around all of that, which finishes off the foliage. I added all the enrichment to the habitat next, before pulling up the terrain and adding a lot more soil everywhere, going in with grass and sand after to balance it all out. And I either purposefully didn't add education speakers and donation bins, or it was an accident. I'll let you decide. Either way though, this habitat was done. And I was back with the sharp tortoises to re-enrich them, with menial success. They're kinda divas, very hard to please. I can respect that though. What I can't respect is making me add more shelter, but I did it anyway. And being needy divas might just be a tortoise trait because I also had to add more enrichment to the Adabra's habitat. On the topic of needy divas though, there was still one more to add to the zoo, that being the Galapagos giant tortoise. At least I think they're the last tortoise on the list. Either way, I set up a habitat for them across from the restaurant I added to the zoo. After they arrived at the habitat, I went about trying to add some trees, but something just didn't look right, so I changed a section of the barrier along the back to no barriers and lined it with rocks. And all was right with the world because there's nothing a rock wall can't fix. My next step was to place a few of these tiny trees around. I also fed a few trees to the rock wall because I thought it would look nice. I also spent some time making sure the tortoises couldn't climb the rocks, after which I added bushes and various other plants around the habitat, stopping to add their enrichment and to make them a shelter. I put up the train tab next, placing a plethora of sand because that's what these divas wanted the most of. I went back in after to add grass around all the vegetation. And after adding donation bins and education speakers, I copied a cluster of rocks and added some along the barrier, and just a few in the water. Not too much, because I didn't want to take up all their traversable terrain with rocks. And that was the Galapagos giant tortoise habitat done. There was quite a lot of upset throughout the zoo over being hungry and thirsty, so I took a break from habitat making to add benches and vending machines throughout the zoo. The tortoise baby overflow area was also kind of getting out of hand at this point, so I put a band-aid on the issue for now by extending the barrier and adding some more shelter. That particular band-aid's not gonna last these ravenous divas long though. And when it rains it pours. Since when are tortoises agile enough to climb stuff? It's rude behavior. As a palate cleanser from devious diva tortoises, I jumped into making a habitat for one of my favorite reptiles, the Nile monitor. I started by extending a path along the back of the Asian water monitor habitat, taking time to also plan where the habitat after the Nile monitors will go. I set them up a wooden barrier with no barriers along the front, after which I went about adding the water source, only to realize that I should probably have the Nile monitors brought to the habitat so I know exactly how big to make said water, at which point it started raining. I played with the water a while longer before ending up with this funny worm shape. I placed down their desired enrichment items, after which I covered the no barrier along the front with this fence, before deciding that I hated it and using glass instead. I took a brief 10-second hiatus to pop some flyaway balloons I saw. Very good. After which I pulled up the nature tab and added some lotus plants to the water. I added a few weeping willows along with a fair amount of eelgrass to make the water look more interesting. I finished the greenery by adding a plethora of bushes and various other plants, which far surpassed their coverage limits, but that's fine. I added a small section of rock to the back of the barrier, which I was going to avoid doing because I felt like I've done a lot of rock walls in this zoo already, but then I realized that I didn't really care. I copied a cluster of smaller rocks, which I littered around the habitat, keeping most of them around the water, but also trying not to cover all the traversable terrain with rocks. I placed donation bins and education speakers, and that was this habitat done. My next course of action was to add a square section of path and add 4 more exhibit animals, which were the desert horned viper, the diamondback turpine, the lesser iguana, and the puff adder. And seeing as I had already set up the path for the next habitat, I jumped straight into it, setting up a glass barrier with no barriers along the back. The glass being an underwater view for what will be the Gariole's habitat, which I'm not sure I've built a habitat for since I started recording Planet Zoo. But these funny long-nosed guys are definitely one of my favorite reptiles in the game, and for that reason they deserve a rock wall. So I set one up along the null barrier before one of them could scuttle their way out of the habitat. These guys also like a whole lot of coverage, which I always love to see. I gave them a weeping willow tree, after which I went into the water to add all the plants, finishing the water off with some water lilies and lotus plants, sprinkling some reeds along the edge of the water while I was at it. I then sunk these bamboo plants into the rock wall because I thought it looked nice, after which I threw a plethora of fun-colored plants around to finish off the greenery. I added their enrichment items and put up the terrain tab, adding sand along the edge of the water, before blending it in with grass. To finish off the terrain, I added long grass around most of the foliage, and after placing donation bins and education speakers, this habitat was done. I went about connecting the 2 ends of my zoo with a long path around this hill, after which I tried my best to make the next habitat barrier, but it just wasn't working out, so I took a minute to do some zoo maintenance before hopping into the next habitat. One of those things being making a whole new habitat for the Aldabra tortoises, one that would be big enough for both the babies and the adults. During which I went into the workshop and downloaded these rock shelters. I placed one in the new Aldabra tortoise habitat, which I think is like the third one I've made for them in this video, but they had all outgrown the habitats they had been in, so it needed to be done. I'm not going to walk through exactly how I made this habitat because, like I said, this is the third one for this species, but I found the end result to be very satisfactory for both them and me. And since the baby Aldabras wouldn't be needing this area anymore, I simply deleted the barrier and let it become an extension of the African spurred tortoise habitat, which I redecorated to their liking. I also noticed how close I was to a 5-star zoo. The only thing I was lacking stars in was marketing, which was an easy enough fix. I placed another exhibit over by the gharials, which housed some common death adders. And while I was at it, I figured I would add the last 2 exhibit animals to the zoo, those being the western diamondback rattlesnake and the yellow anaconda. At which point I was ready to add the next habitat, but first I went about removing the no longer in use Aldabra tortoise habitat, and I thought about putting another habitat in that space, but it just wouldn't be big enough for any of the animals I still needed to add, so I scrapped that idea, and instead set up a wood and glass barrier across from the new Aldabra tortoise habitat, which is going to house saltwater crocodiles.
Ugly. Why are they built like that?
I started the habitat by adding texture to the water so it wasn't all flat and boring. I also added another little land area off to the side, after which I placed down all their enrichment items, and opened up the nature tab to add some greenery, starting with these custard apple trees, along with sprinkling a few reeds along the edge of the water, before moving underwater to add more greenery, which I was a little sparse with, but that's fine because I fill in the empty space with a good amount of rocks. After which I pulled up the terrain tab and added a bit of sand and a whole lot more soil to the habitat. And after adding a few rocks along the back, along with placing donation bins and education speakers, this habitat was done. Probably one of the most plain habitats I've ever made, but that's fine. Also, I didn't add a shelter for these guys because they didn't need one. I jumped straight into the last habitat for this video, which is going to be for the spectacled caiman. I had a brief debate with myself as to where this habitat was going to go, before deciding that it would go next to the gharials. So after setting up a path, I made a barrier, after which I had the caimans brought to the habitat, where I watched them scuttle about for a minute because I thought it was funny. I added a water source next, which I was trying to give a swampy wetlands vibe. I'm not really sure if that comes across well or not, but I tried. And since these guys don't require any shelter, I jumped straight into adding the greenery, starting with Amazon water lilies along with some eelgrass in the water. Added these fun yellow trees before deciding to line the back of the barrier with trees as well, because I thought the back barrier looked kind of funky, and I just didn't think this habitat would look good with a rock wall. Finishing off the greenery, I added a few mangrove trees and an assortment of plants and bushes, after which I added all their enrichment items and played with the terrain a little bit, before adding donation bins and education speakers and copying a cluster of rocks to add around the habitat. I kept the rock clusters mostly around the water, which wasn't hard to do considering most of the habitat had water running through it. Either way, with the rocks added, this habitat was done. There were a few final touches I wanted to add to the zoo though, such as refreshing the enrichment in all the habitats that needed it, along with replacing all the current staff buildings I had placed with these pre-built ones, because decorating buildings in this game does not bring me joy, for the most part at least. I also went back and added more rocks to the American alligator and dwarf caiman habitats, because I thought they would look better with more rocks, and I was right. I then went back into the menu to check what continent and biome I made my zoo in, so that I could find a tree that would make sense to add around the zoo as a final touch. I, however, accidentally clicked on temperate instead of tropical, and didn't notice until I was done placing trees. I strongly considered ignoring my mistake and letting it be, and I committed to doing that just long enough to add a few decorations around the zoo, and to place a shopping area where the previous Aldabra tortoise habitat had been, after which I decided that I was bothered enough to delete all the temperate trees I'd placed, and spent another 10 minutes placing a tropical tree this time, and with that, this zoo was finished. So that'll be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did enjoy watching, maybe consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye!